and good evening to you there in Moscow. I hope that this broadcast finds you. I'm going to be doing a lot of the talking today. Talinn is going to evaluate whether what I'm saying is good or not, and be chiming in every once in a while. And so here we go. All right, so oops. So regarding limitations, is it important to mention limitations in an article? What do you think? I think it is a kind of hedge, meaning that you are being careful about how strongly you are asserting your claims, and also what was said earlier about transparency. I agree. I like to compare it to, for example, imagine this is a car ad. This is a car, an advertisement selling a car. And if you obviously you see the picture here, and then you see a description. Great car, not a new car, but good fuel economy and will reliably get you to work. Never gave me problems, make me an offer. Okay. Well, you could say that to some extent this is being transparent, because yes, they're being honest, it's not a new car. That's clear. And it is saying that, well, it's reliable and so on. But if you were looking at this ad and you see this photograph, you're seeing that there's more stuff wrong with this car than they're saying here. Maybe these problems are not affecting the drivability of the car. Maybe the car is still drivable despite this unsightly appearance, but it's not being mentioned here. And so I guess this is kind of a key thing for me, and I think most of you have alluded to this, is that there's no such thing as a perfect method. And if you are a critical reader, which of course all of the reviewers of your manuscripts will be very critical, when they're reading your manuscript, they're seeing this bent hood of the car. They're seeing this damaged fender and what it looks like a broken taillight. And yet, it's not being mentioned here in the description of the car. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean that the car isn't reliable. It doesn't necessarily mean that the car is not worth the price that they're asking, which is not mentioned here. But it does raise suspicion. What else might they be hiding here? Here I'm just seeing a photograph of the front. What else could there be that they're not talking about here? And this is what you don't want to have happen, is you don't want the reviewer of your article to see obvious potential issues that may affect the results of your study or whatever the focus of your research is, potential issues, i.e. limitations, and have those not be mentioned, and then raise the suspicion of, okay, so what else is she or he hiding? And suddenly be afraid to say, yes, this is publishable research. You don't want to say that. Is that being transparent and being honest about potential issues or what obvious issues there are also means that can be kind of disarming to the critical reader. Like, okay, this person acknowledges that there are issues, but this is not going to affect the study, just as maybe in this fictitious example here, the person placing the ad might say something like, in the photograph, you see that there is a damaged headlight, but it still works and it doesn't affect the drivability of the car. Or, yes, you can see in the photograph that the headlight is damaged, and this should be easily replaced and shouldn't affect the way the car drives, or whatever it may be. That would, me, if I were a potential buyer for this car, send a message of, okay, there are issues, but the person's being honest about it, and now I can assess whether or not want to buy it, just as a reviewer could say, okay, yes, there are issues in the method, okay, fine, but it doesn't seem to be affecting what the findings are or the validity of the research itself. Today, I want to talk about, not only why are limitations important, but where do authors usually mention limitations? What actually are the drivers? What drives limitations? Where should limitations appear? And spoiler alert, it shouldn't be in just one place. And what are some strategies, practical strategies for discussing limitations? And I'll end by talking about ways that we all can improve the way we present and think about the limitations of our own studies. All right. So as most of you, I'm sure, are already aware, a typical discussion section of most research articles will contain any number of these elements, often these in conjunction with each other and often in this kind of order. So if they're talking about points raised in the introduction of the article, talking about how the results found compare to other studies in the same area, then kind of interpreting, explaining what the results mean, talking about the practical implications, talking about limitations, and talking about how the study, whatever research it is, the contribution that it makes to the science and what is still needed in terms of future research. But I want to talk about today how this is something that, first of all, should not be a separate section talked about in isolation, and in fact can be used strategically in conjunction with other sections, integrated with other sections, and not in the kind of perfunctory way that a lot of authors do, only talking about the most obvious things like, oh, this study had a small population sample, or this study was conducted in Russia, so we can't say that it's generalizable to the entire universe. These are the typical things that authors say, which to me and to most critical reviewers suggest, okay, this person has not really critically assessed the limitations of their own study. Okay. So let me ask you this. Considering the sections of an IMRAD, which Talinn and I talked about last week, and we'll reiterate now, the introduction, method, result, and discussion, and reiterating what we talked about last week, that the title should be considered a gateway into this interconnected structure. Where do limitations stem from? In other words, when you talk about limitations, what are you talking about? Are you talking about the limitations of the literature that you cite? Are you talking about limitations in the method? Are you talking about limitations in discussion? In your view, where do limitations come from? So let me give you an example, a practical example of that, where it can come from just about any part. Recently, as I think I mentioned last week, I'm an associate editor for a journal, and I'm going to show you one of the reviewers' comments. Now, I've altered both the title and the comments so that you can't tell what the actual manuscript was. So I've anonymized it. And I should also say that the manuscript wasn't rejected. But there were 3 reviews, and the 3 reviewers mentioned the same issue. And let me show you what it was. And I'm going to focus on one reviewer's comments especially. So the title has been altered, but essentially it was like this: the effect of multi-country collaboration on research article citation. Okay, now those of you who attended Talinn and my talk last week, do you remember what we said about titles? Titles, what do titles do? They set expectations, right? So what would your expectation be if you see this title? And I'm looking especially at at this?
It makes me think that if there are multiple countries represented among the authorship, that has some impact, I'm assuming a positive impact on the number of citations.
Yeah, and you would expect, this is an obvious point, you'd expect multiple countries. Right?
That seems essential.
That seems essential. That is an expectation that you would have multiple countries. But look at what the reviewer said. So here you see that what kind of went wrong was that the authors basically set themselves up for disappointment unnecessarily. They disappointed, they misled, for lack of a better spin on this. They misled the reader with certain expectation, which led to disappointment. And but why do you think that the authors chose this title instead of, I don't know, writing The Effect of Russia-Belarus Collaboration? Yeah, maybe it sounds more impressive. And I think maybe that's what happened here. But then what happened was it just set themselves up for disappointment. And so what the reviewer points out is I think clarifying around this in your title, your abstract, and periodically throughout the rest of your paper would strengthen the work. They're not saying that you can't generalize. He's not saying, or she, that you can't generalize talking about how important multi-country collaboration is, but certainly don't set the expectation already in the title. And then again, as Talinn presented last week, in the abstract, so that the person just is looking for more countries than there are. And so again, this didn't cause the manuscript to get rejected, but it certainly didn't cause a positive impression. And then again, all three reviewers, they all had the same consensus about this, that they needed to not over generalize the importance or the relevance of their findings. And so this is where I think a lot of authors get into trouble, is that they maybe unintentionally want to inflate the importance of the research when the data and the research itself don't support that. And that's where they can get into trouble and even sometimes cause a rejection. So that often happens, most typically though, not in the title like this, is just to show you that it should be, you should be aware of that everywhere, but it happens especially in the method section. And this is where really, I think your thinking about limitations needs to begin. This is where the limitations around the method should drive some of the things that you say in the introduction, should drive your presentation of the results, and especially how you discuss those results. I'm going to show you a video. This is a non-specialist video. Doesn't matter if you are in a STEM field or another field, it doesn't matter. You'll be able to understand this video. And as you watch this, maybe you'll need like a pen and paper to just take a few notes to answer these questions. Imagine that this is a study. It is a kind of mini study that you're going to see. First, what was the objective of the study? Two, what instruments were used? The video is very fast, so you'll have to kind of pay close attention to this. What procedure was used? What was the result? And then number 5, and this is the most important question. Do you have questions about the method?
What's up, guys? I'm GQ's editorial assistant and team captain for today's deodorant challenge. We're out here gonna play some ball and test some deodorants, and I'll let you know which one will protect your sweaty man parts best.
I'll take the Old Spice.
Axe.
Proven stamina.
Melon and guts.
All right, so we may not have won out there, but the real test is on now, which is whose armpit smells best. Referee?
Okay. Sorry to show you such a disgusting video. If it makes you feel any better, I just had breakfast. You're at least are in the evening time. Let's go back to these questions here.
I'm not sure that would pass an IRB protocol for keeping participants safe.
Yeah, I don't think they went through ethics committees for that one. Yeah, so just as a reminder, these are the questions. So what was the objective? What instruments were used? What procedure was used? What was the result? And do you have any questions about the method? I won't say any more about that. I'll let you collectively go over that. So what you're going to do next is you're going to have 12 minutes to talk about these questions. And in particular, I want you to focus on this last one here. Do you have questions about the method? So for example, why did they choose these particular deodorants? Something like that. But you probably have a lot of other questions beyond that that will affect the validity of the result, question number 4. Okay, so it was very interesting seeing the questions. All of you had some good questions. I'm just going to highlight a few, even though there are many more than the ones I'll highlight here. So group 1 said, did she sniff at the same distance for everyone? Makes sense, right? I mean, if you if you stick your nose right up there, obviously there's going to be a change in the intensity of the smell. So there should have been maybe some kind of implementation of uniformity of distance to not have that as a confounding variable in the smell tests. And they explain, they say, we don't trust that the sniffer was having the same experience each time. Okay, now so you can imagine that if you are a manuscript reviewer, and if this was a real method, a real research, you would have that question, and quite rightly so. And so it should be explained, and it should be on your mind as a writer that this is a problem. Another question that group 1 had was, and I've never seen this one come up before, but it's very interesting. Was it applied evenly? That makes sense too. I mean, even a variable such as the pressure of applying, did they just kind of dab it on, you know, or did they really make sure that there was an equal application, and how would they even do that? So the reason they asked this question is if it wasn't applied fully, that would change the efficacy of the product, clearly, which raises other questions of, okay, is there a difference between roll-on and spray, for example?
Oh, and to make this even grosser, I just realized, like, what about the level of armpit hair, which would impact how much got to the source? And yeah.
Yeah, that's another one. So if somebody had a, I don't want to make this even grosser, but yeah, if somebody has an excessive amount of body hair, wouldn't that be a kind of barrier? Okay, so I won't go on that too much. Group 2. Why are the conditions inconsistent? So, for example, why was the effect of fabric not considered? Exactly. So you had in some cases a person wearing a particular kind of cotton fabric, another person wearing maybe something that was more of a synthetic fabric. In addition, as some of you talked about in your groups, you had some people that were wearing short-sleeved shirts and others that were wearing tank tops. So again, wouldn't that affect the smell? Group 2 also talked about how it didn't seem to be a randomized selection, just a convenience sample. So that would, you're talking about here potential bias. Question number 4 here with group 2, how can we prove that the tester measures what is supposed to be measured? Did she like the perfume? Or so are there other variables involved there beyond just the testing and of the smell of the deodorant itself? And that comes up in group 3 as well. We'll talk about that in a second. In group 2, also asked in question 5, is the level of involvement in the game the same? In other words, I think what they're talking about, how about the intensity of the activity? So was everybody equally involved in the basketball game? Or did some participate more and therefore sweat more? Wouldn't that change the smell? What were the criteria used to choose the tester? Is the lady related to any of the guys? And so that kind of leads me to group 3's question here about, is it only about the smell? In other words, did she find, one of the guys maybe more attractive than another guy? And wouldn't that affect what's called the hedonicity of the experience? And question 3 here, issue 3, the girl could have some preferences over the men body smell and the smell of the deodorant. So why was this girl selected? That would have to be made explicit. What were the criteria for selecting? And then group 4, talk about the sample size. So yeah, you have 4 participants, which makes you question about the representativeness of the results. But in addition, as group 4 also pointed out when I was talking to them, is that if you have 1 deodorant per armpit with a distributed amongst these guys, then you don't have any way of measuring the generalizability, only because each one of those deodorants is going to be interaction with that person. And so some of the smell attributes will be you can only talk about that smell as it pertains to that participant, not generalize the findings. So definitely too small. And then finally in group 5, how did the participants prepare for the experiment? So things like, did they all shower before engaging in the experiment? If they did shower, was it the same amount of time before the experiment? Did they use the same soap? All of these things. So I mean, this is just obviously a kind of goofy commercial and everything, but it does on a very simple level. You can see how all of these variables, you can see that they would affect the results. And so either the person who's writing up these results has to keep these in mind and not hide them. They have to talk about them, because if you can identify them, then everybody who reads the article, if there's an article associated with this, will be able to see the same thing. So getting back to the presentation, this was the result, as it were. And most empirical research articles have some kind of results section. But by the time the reviewer gets to the results section, she or he is going to be thinking about the validity of that result. Okay, so what begat this result? What yielded this result? And if they see problems in the method, which every method has, how valid is that result? And they're going to be aware, the reviewer is going to already be aware of the issues with the method by the time they get to the results. And so they're going to be expecting, by the time they get to the discussion section, that the person talks about those limitations, all of the issues that may have affected the results or the findings. And if they don't, then that's a problem, because this is the person that you need to be writing for and keeping in mind on whenever you're writing your research is the naysayer, right? The naysayer is every reviewer you'll ever encounter. It's every reader of your article. Obviously, you can't think that the editor of the journal or the reviewers are sympathetic with your research or sympathetic with your method or your findings. They are going to be a critical reader. And so part of that criticality involves you acknowledging that this person is going to have questions about things like, okay, why was this person selected? Does she have any kind of relationship to this participant? Who is this participant? And what is this thing that she's carrying in her hand? This needs to be described. Why is she using this? By the way, it's coffee grounds. She's making notes. What are those notes? And who decided what those notes were going to be? Was she trained before engaging in this experiment? As you mentioned, was there any control of the distance between her nose and this person's armpit? Was there any kind of control over consideration of the person having a barrier here versus this person over here? All these things that you and your groups discussed, and these, in this little funny experiment, clearly affected the results. That doesn't necessarily mean that it invalidates the finding or invalidates the research. It could, but it certainly means that these things you need to discuss the findings in the light of these limitations. Say, okay, yes, there are these problems, but we think that the results are still valid or have some meaning because of this, that, and the other thing. So any method at all has limits, always, and you definitely need to be aware of what those limitations are, because certainly your reader will be, just like with this car here, you can see them, you can see it's really clear, and if they're not acknowledged, then this just weakens weakens the strength of your article. It weakens the impression of how valid your research is, and therefore, to put it another way, the cognizance of your method and being honest about them and it's about its limitations, then have a positive effect, and it's strengthening your article. But let's get away from the silly deodorant discussion for a section. And oh yeah, and I want to also mention that a lot of people think, unfortunately, that talking about limitations means talking about defects, and I want to change that idea. That as I mentioned, being aware of and being transparent of the limitations, and again, every single study has limitations. It can be a strength, can strengthen your article. People are often afraid of putting in being transparent because they think that actually weakens the article and your research, and that is not necessarily the case. So you always have to be aware of this naysayer when you're writing. He's always there. And good writers, they are constantly aware of this person as they're writing. They're not running away from him. They're engaging with that person in a strategic way. I'm going to show you a real, now not a deodorant commercial example, but a real example of how things can get into trouble. So many of you may remember that early on in the pandemic, there was some talk about this hydroxychloroquine and a possible combination of azithromycin to help in the treatment of COVID-19. And there was this article, this Gautret et al. Article, that was widely touted at the beginning because a lot of people, including the President Trump at the time, wanted a quick fix for the problem. And this was seen as a cheap and fast way to do it. And it all started really with this research here. This eventually came out in this journal, the International Journal of Antimicrobial Agents. However, immediately the naysayers out there began to notice some issues. And again, any research has issues, but the problem with this was the way the issues were presented or not presented. So Elizabeth Bick, she's a blogger. She's a contributor to and a blogger about this in this blog here called Science Integrity Digest. And so this is a blog in which she and others discuss research that is important at any given time. And this one was a big one. And so she talks about this Gautret et al. Paper. And she mentions how there's a lot of excitement about it. But what she does is she deconstructs research to point out where there may be issues. And here she points out, she says, there are some confounding factors. She says, in an ideal clinical trial study, the control group and treatment group should be as similar as possible. Just like you can think of the deodorant people, right? Not having different clothes, not having different body types or whatever, as similar as possible. Patients should be of similar age and gender ratio, be equally sick at the start of treatment, this is COVID, and analyzed in the same way. The only difference between the two groups should be whether the patients received the treatment or not. So they can isolate the main variable, in this case, what caused the patient to get better or not. That's a very kind of simple way of putting it. Now she says, Elizabeth Bick says, here, however, the control and treatment group differ in various other ways from each other. Scientists call those confounding factors, factors other than the treatment that are different between the controls and treated patients that might explain the different outcomes. So just like comparing again to the deodorant thing, the fact that you had different clothing and apparently different deodorants even, those could have been confounding factors, so that there was no way of identifying, or difficult to identify, if the deodorant itself was causing the pleasant smell or if there were other confounding factors. All right, so then she goes on, she says, in this paper, the control and treated patients were also not randomized, as is usual in a trial like this. Some patients were chosen to be treated, while other patients were chosen to serve as controls. That might bring along all kinds of biases in which, e.g., researchers might be tempted to favor sicker patients, or patients that have been sick longer to be chosen in one of the different groups. Just like you question, okay, why was this woman chosen? Did she have any relationship to the person? Was there any kind of bias there? And then she says, unfortunately, the lead author of the paper, Didier Raoult, does not believe in randomized clinical trials. Okay, you can tell that she's already not very sympathetic with this research. Again, though, any research, any method has limitations. So that's okay so far. I mean, but let's see what she says. Let's see how Didier Raoult and the lead author, Gautret, present the results. So when they discuss the results, here's what they say. look at the first paragraph. And just in the first paragraph, do you see any word that to you sounds like, uh-oh, they're sounding confident. They're sounding maybe too confident. Any word there in the first paragraph of the discussion that might awaken the naysayer?
So significant and evident.
Yeah, so anybody, any reviewer of any study, doesn't matter how strong the results are, if you see a claim formulated like this, for ethical reasons, because our first results are so significant and evident, already the impression is, wow, these people are very, very confident of their findings. And the effect is, in that case, may be the opposite of what the authors intend. Because if they are sounding so confident, if the reviewer, the naysayer, might think, oh, wait a minute, is there really a basis for them to be so confident? Is their confidence really that justified? Maybe if they had put it a different way, if they had hedged their or not mentioned, not said so significant, then maybe it wouldn't have had that effect. But because they start like this, so significant, I can just hear the reader and people like Elizabeth Bick saying, wait a minute. So they go on and they say, we show here that hydroxychloroquine is efficient in clearing viral nasopharyngeal carriage, blah, blah, blah. And a significant difference was observed. And then they go on, and you can see in the third sentence here at the bottom, they do it again. They say, these results are of great importance because a recent paper has shown the mean duration. And it's almost as if that they're really kind of inflating the importance of the findings and what they mean. But the problem is that in the reader's mind, in the critical reader's mind, such as the mind of Elizabeth Bick, when they got to the discussion section, they were already aware of issues in the method. They were already aware. Anybody who knows anything about science and controlled groups and scientific method would have read the method section, like Elizabeth Bick did, was already aware of the issues, and then expected to see some mention of that in the discussion. And yet they start with just basically saying, our study is great. Then they do mention something about a limitation here. Say, the cause for a failure of hydroxychloroquine treatment should be investigated by testing the isolated SARS-CoV-2 strains of the non-respondents and analyzing their genome, and by analyzing the host factors that might be associated with metabolism of hydroxychloroquine. The existence of hydroxychloroquine failure in 2 patients, mother and son, is more suggestive of the last mechanism of resistance. They don't mention here about the problem with randomized, double-blind, random sampling. They don't mention, controls as a limitation. Instead, they put the blame on the DNA and the genetics of the mother and son, saying, oh, because these 2 here didn't respond, it must be because they're related, which may have been true, but they didn't acknowledge the more obvious problem, which is they can't, with a lot of confidence, say, these people got better because of the intervention. These people got better because of hydroxychloroquine. They can't do that because that's not the method that they used. So you might be wondering why this was published. Well, obviously with the backdrop of the pandemic, that helped. People wanted to get research out there, but there's something else here. Look at this paper here. It was received March 16th 2020 and accepted on March 17th and made available on March 20th. Any of you who have published before know that this is not the usual path of publication. Usually when you send something to a journal, it doesn't get accepted the next day, even in the light of the urgency of the situation here. And so you might be thinking, okay, what happened here? Well, as it turns out, one of the authors in this paper is also the editor-in-chief of that journal. So, I mean, as if everything else wasn't bad enough, there was obviously a conflict of interest. And so, as this person says, Elizabeth Biggs says, this would be the equivalent of allowing a student to grade their own paper. Lo and behold, the student got an A+. And so if this had gone through a regular, normal peer review process, I can almost guarantee you that the reviewers, the naysayers, would have had questions about the method and would have asked them to tone down the confidence with which they were stating claims in the discussion section. As it turned out, it was too late. The paper was published. And then when the science world saw it, then they really criticized it profoundly. And then any possible redeeming property of the research was overshadowed by the defects that people found in the method and the lack of discussion of those defects in the paper. Now let's go to another example, unfortunately going back to body odor. I'm not obsessed with body odor, it's just I think it's one of those things that we can all, relate to. We all have a body odor. And in this case, we're going to talk about body odor and food. Again, we all eat, so something we can relate to. And so in this case, there's an interesting study that I found some years back about what is the effect of meat consumption on body odor attractiveness. The deodorant commercial or whatever that I showed you earlier is a warm-up for this. And you can see now the difference. That was maybe a bad example of a presentation of a method that raised a lot of questions. Now you'll be able to see here something that is kind of in a similar vein, but in which much more care was taken. So this is in a journal called Chemical Senses. Obviously, the focus is on meat, and just like with the deodorant, you already immediately raised some questions about, okay, so how do they know if the meat consumption affected the smell? Did they control for the amount of meat? These are questions that you would have as a reviewer even before reading the article. Now we kind of come full circle, to talking about the method section. And now I want to look at, with limitations, how do all the parts fit together? We focus on the method, but as I tried to emphasize at the beginning, these parts actually interconnect. And so limitations should be, borne in mind throughout. And how does that happen? Well, we'll go to the abstract now. The abstract here says auxiliary body odor is individually specific and potentially a rich source of information about its producer. So move one. Odor individuality partly results from genetic individuality, but the influence of ecological factors such as eating habits are another main source of odor variability. Okay, still establishing territory here. Notice that they're talking about genetics, and then they talk about eating. However, we know very little about how particular dietary components shape our body odor. So this is what's called move two, pointing out there's a gap in the knowledge. They don't know about how diet may influence odor. Here, we tested the effect of red meat consumption on body odor attractiveness. When we talk about the method, we use a balance within sub-experimental design. We talk about the participants, some were meat and non-meat, and they were called odor donors. You heard about blood donors. Here they talk about the participants as odor donors, and they were on a diet for 2 weeks. Already here you can contrast this abstract and the discussion of the method with the rather weak method that was employed in the deodorant, because here you can see you have two conditions. You have meat In non-meat, you have a control. It's within subject, and then you have in control for the diet. You have control for time, 2 weeks. They're wearing the instruments they're using for collection. They call them auxiliary pads. There's like these little pads they put on. They all have the same pads. They collected the odor during the final 24 hours of the diet. So there's control for the time again. Then they say fresh odor samples were assessed. Now here you might think as a reviewer, okay, how did they control freshness? How is that? And then they're assessed with pleasantness, attractiveness, masculinity. You might have some questions about that. And then it's not one woman, but by 30 women, and who are not using hormonal contraceptives. And you might be thinking, what does that have to do with anything? Well, actually, it turns out that this thing about not using hormonal contraceptives is an important thing, and already signals to the naysayer, okay, so they actually, were careful about this method. Then they repeated the same procedure at a time 2, a month later, with the same odor donors, so the same participants, each on the opposite diet, so it was counterbalanced. Then they had a repeated measure analysis of variance, and so on and so forth. So the impression is here already with the abstract, okay, so they're being very careful with the method. And so they have then the findings. And so you think back to that deodorant finding, I don't remember the brand that was the winner, the result. Here, the result is that red meat consumption has a negative impact on perceived body odor hedonicity. But different from the deodorant commercial, here you can say, okay, maybe there's some validity to this because they were so careful. All right, or at least it's suggestive of that. So in the introduction, notice how they're already setting the reader up for parts of the method. So in the introduction, the introduction is not a general, just a discussion about everything about smell that existed in the world of science, but you can see that they specifically mention particular elements. So here they say, however, not only is body odor pre-programmed by genetic factors, but also much variability is due to psychophysiological and ecological influences. Okay, so already in the very first sentence, they are acknowledging important variables. If they're mentioning this variable, these variables, then it should signal to the reader, okay, then these are variables that should be controlled for. Also, the mention of these variables is signaling to the critical reader, the expert in the area, that, okay, so they are aware of the variables that can affect smell. So they've already said, okay, genetic factors, but also psychophysiological, so mood, and ecological, so things like diet. So for instance, they talk about shown repeatedly that body odor changes across women's menstrual cycles. Suddenly they're talking about ovulation and menstrual cycle. Again, if they're mentioning this here in the introduction, it means that the authors are signaling 2 things. They're signaling that they are aware that this can affect smell, and 2, that this is going to be a variable that they will control for in the method. Other studies found that mood of a target person may influence hedonic perception. Again, going back to the psychophysiological influences. And then finally, eating habits also may have a crucial impact. They're saying may have because they don't know yet. That's the reason they're conducting this study. Very little is known about the effect of alimentary components, food, on human body odor. And then they talk about some folk beliefs connect odor hedonicity with meat consumption. For instance, this is kind of funny. Hindu Indians who are usually vegetarian say that people who eat meat smell bad because of it. That's Komarek, personal communication. Just as an aside, I've always wondered about this personal communication. Like, what did Komarek say exactly? Was it over, a coffee one day? They said, oh, I think that people who eat meat smell bad, or was it an email? I don't know, but apparently it was a personal communication. And they say, well, to our knowledge, this effect has not been tested under controlled conditions. and they're already setting up what the controls will be. So that's how the introduction is connecting now to the method section. See the variables mentioned here. Now, here's the method section, and notice the care that they take to provide details about who they chose, why they chose that person, and so on. To try to isolate as much as possible the variable of smell hedonicity. So they say, raters were contacted by email or person by the authors. 32 female students, mean age 23.3 years, minimum 19 years, maximum 32 years, took part in the study. 2 of them, however, did not finish both sessions, were excluded. None of the women were using hormonal contraception. Okay, so they've already talked about it in the introduction, that hormones can affect smell. So they made sure that this was controlled for. But this was already mentioned in the introduction. It's not a surprise here why it's there. It was already signaled in the introduction. And all reported having normal menstrual cycle length. They were also asked about the date of their onset of their last menstrual bleeding, day 1. Women in days 9 to 15 of their cycle on the testing day were judged to be in the fertile phase and others to be in non-fertile phase of the cycle. As the experiment was composed of 2 rating sessions, we decided to perform the second session 28 days after the first one to minimize the possible effect of menstrual cycling. So notice 2 things here. You find that in the method section, they're not only saying what they did, but also why they did it. So here, they say they decided to perform the second session 28 days after. Why? To minimize the effect of the effect of menstrual cycle on raters of olfactory sensitivity. They could have, many authors will just say, we performed the session 28 days after, and then leave it to the reader to infer why they did that. But no, here they do what I think is a good strategy, which is to say what they did and then why they did it. All right, so then, and again, this is keeping in mind the naysayer all the time. All the time it's in keeping in mind that this guy is looking for the limitations of the method, limitations of the research. So now here comes the discussion. This is where you typically find explicit mention of limitations. So it says, the results of this study show for the first time that red meat consumption may have a perceivable impact on auxiliary body odor. Notice the contrast between the hydroxychloroquine COVID article, which said, so significant. Here, you don't see so, you see this word may. We're going to come back to this in a minute. Excuse me. May have a perceivable impact. Odors of donors on the non-meat diet were judged, passive voice, were judged as more pleasant, more attractive, and less intense. That's a fact. That's what happened. This pattern was not influenced by raters' menstrual cycle phase or partnership status. This here is not a necessary part of the discussion, but they're reiterating this fact to say, this is why we believe our results are valid. Mentioning again, hey, we controlled for menstrual cycle. We controlled for if they were married or single. Now, they get to a limitation. They say, the number of odor donors was relatively small, 17 men. Okay, that's a limitation. They don't say this is a limitation, but clearly they're signaling a limitation. Now, notice what they do next. They say, however, the nature of the experiment was balanced and within subject. In other words, each rater assessed some donors first in the meat condition and some donors first in non-meat. Moreover, the diet we prescribed to our odor donors was identical except the meat content. So, what do you see here? You see that they are aware of the naysayer here, that this person needs to be reminded that, okay, this is why this claim is justifiable. This claim here can be supported. Here in the limitation presented, they're saying yes, there's limitation, but why, despite this limitation, why is the result still meaningful? And they explain that. Yes, there's a limitation here, only 17 men. However, it's still meaningful, still significant because this is what we did. And they don't say just what they did. Again, they say why they did it that way and what that means. So in other words, each rater did this, and then the diet we prescribed, so they're explaining that they're making a claim that it was still meaningful and why that claim is valid. So this is also acknowledging the naysayer here, knowing, as good writers do, aware that this person's looking for limitations. One obvious one here is that you had a relatively small, and this could be mentioned by the reviewer in the study, 17 men only. But why is the result still meaningful? And then they explain it. The effect then on the naysayer is, okay, yeah, I was going to mention this in my critical review here, but they've already talked about it. So that's a pretty good article. This is what's called making a concession. And this is a strategy I've taught people to use before, and I recommend, because you should be aware that the naysayer is aware of what the issues are, what the limitations are. So just be transparent about it. Make that concession, but make the concession and then follow it up with why the results are still worth considering despite that problem or that limitation. Let's see some more examples. The naysayer might have thought, you can imagine the person writing this thinks, he might think, but what about mood? Mood can influence the smell too, right? Well, in case you skip the method section and the introduction, they say here, well, theoretically, our diet may have influenced the mood of donors, which may in turn have impacted the quality of body odor. This is what research has shown before, but what do they follow this up with? However, this is probably not the case, definitely not the case, but this is probably not the case, as we did not find differences in self-rated stress, fatigue, and mood between the meat and non-meat conditions. The reliability of the results is also supported by the fact that mean ratings across 2 sessions were not significantly different and that there was no change in masculinity rating across experimental conditions. So they're saying, hey, naysayer, I know what you're thinking. Maybe the mood affected, but hey, remember, we have in our method section, we have controls for this. This is what's called a move of hypothetical real. Hypothetical meaning this is what could have influenced it, yes, but in fact, what really happened was this. We did this in our method, even though this could theoretically, hypothetically be that. That's not what really happened. Again, this is not weakening the research. This is strengthening your argument. Naysayer may have thought, okay, but is it the meat? You're talking about meat here, but or maybe it's just the protein. And then they say, well, potentially our findings may be a result of different energetic protein values. In other words, our diet only differed in meat content and therefore in energetic value. Thus, this factor can be responsible for the effect, not the meat per se. Again, hypothetical, real. However, the real part, if this would be the case, one may expect diet of higher energetic value, meat diet, to be more attractive, as was found in the Bank Bowl study. And this is where they converse with other studies. Our results show higher attractiveness in the non-meat diet. We therefore believe it is caused by the meat specifically. Another one that the naysayer, again, imagine their imagination writing, oh, he might say this, well, changes were probably quantitative, not qualitative. Well, no. One may argue, and who is one here? One is this guy. There is no one, but they're putting this hypothetical. One may argue that the higher attractiveness of donors on the non-meat diet is due to quantitative rather than qualitative changes in the auxiliary odor. In our view, however, meat consumption changes the composition of some auxiliary chemicals, and therefore, and they're going to explain this more, we believe that both changes of quantitative and qualitative nature are responsible for the observed effect. And then here's where I want to say, that even when you talk about limitations, they can be put into a positive spin, as you'll see. In other words, taking lemons and making them into lemonade. So talking about what your research, the limitations of your research, but why that's a good thing. And so here's an example. At this point, it is not possible to say how long the meat content in food remains perceptible in auxiliary odor. This is a limitation, not a limitation of the method, but a limitation of the generalizability of the study. They've captured one moment, but what if a person is on a meat diet and then goes vegetarian? Does that change things? So they say, well, we don't know this, nor do we know how long one must consume meat to produce discernible changes in body odor. Moreover, we can also only speculate about the already perceptible amount of meat consumed. Then you're thinking, why are they saying this? They're saying, what their research doesn't do. But if you keep reading, when they go on and they say 2 weeks diet period we chose for our study was based on results of analytical study. But then they talk about, notice the last sentence here, future studies should address the question of diet duration on quantity of meat consumption and changes to body odor. Further, it should also be tested whether the observed effect is restricted to red meat or may be applied also to white meat. So these are things that are limitations of the research here, but they point the direction, they point to how their research contributes to paving the way for more research in this area. And they cite specific things like white meat versus red meat. Why some authors do this is that it sets, in many cases, it helps tease research that they're already working on, that they will bring, that helps lay the ground and justification for further research in the same vein. So here they may actually already be working on this. It's a research gauntlet that they themselves will be picking up. Now, the way authors talk about the limitations, I think is, and I'll finish on this, is something that's worth mentioning here. You all have already mentioned, or some of you have mentioned the word hedging. In this article, which you can find online, it's open access, called All That Glitters Isn't Gold, a survey on acknowledgement of limitations in biomedical studies. These authors did an analysis of how often do authors include limitations in biomedical studies and how do they do it? And the way they analyzed this is they looked for particular wording. And so here you see in the abstract, which by the way itself has limitations inserted in the study. You can see that they wanted to assess the extent to which limitations are acknowledged. And so what they did was they investigated the use of phrases that express uncertainty, or so-called hedges. And that's one of the most important ways that the authors signal that they are being careful with what they say. Very different from that COVID hydroxychloroquine study that we saw where their claims were so confident and unhedged. Here, the authors looked for words that express uncertainty. And this kind of is counterintuitive to a lot of scientists thinking, well, science is, exact. You don't express uncertainty. And here I would suggest that actually it can be very important, especially in the discussion section. So here you see in the abstract, they already signal with strategically that when they talk about the result, they don't say that it does this as a matter of fact. Instead, they use this keyword suggest, that our study suggests that red meat consumption. They have good evidence for this. The method is valid. It looks like a good method. But even so, they are using careful wording. So what is hedging exactly? Here's some examples of not hedging. Here's an example of not hedging. the coronavirus is never going away. Believe it or not, this is a headline that was, I found, I think it was around July 2020, and it's still valid today, this headline. And you can see that this is not a research article genre. Right? What genre is this? Talinn, why do you think every title is like this now? Why is every title a claim?
I think it's a knock-on effect from clickbait, personally. But I find it really frustrating as somebody who's trying to teach argument and wants to give students an article and then have them analyze it, and the answer is always in the title.
Yeah. So clickbait, attract their attention, making a strong claim, and maybe in sort of journalism that is effective, and certainly in the World Wide Web world, wanting to get people to click on things, this probably works really well. In science, not so much. So while in world of journalism, you see things like this, you do see, even in journalism, some hedging. So, but why? So here you see a different one. This is from April 2020. Coronavirus, deaths at 20-year high, but peak may be over. We all know how that went. But why do you think they chose this word may? Clearly, they didn't know at that time, and to say otherwise would have been completely irresponsible. Same thing with here. Dip in new COVID-19 cases, likely significant delay, cases likely due to significant delay in testing results. So there are a lot of unknowns at that time. So there's likely, they don't know. They didn't know. They had to hedge. Here, the same thing. Health experts warn that COVID-19 could have lasting effects on the body. So at that time, this is again 2020, they didn't know. They have to hedge. Same here. Now, in research articles, it's not because you don't know, but you want to express hedging because you don't want to say that you know the whole story, because we never do in science. Just like in the early days of the pandemic, they wanted to hedge because they didn't know. So a rough definition, this is just my definition for the sake of this talk here. A hedge is a word or phrase used by the authors to show that they are being careful about their claims. Just like you have here with suggests. It suggests to the naysayer that the person is being careful about how they're structuring their claim. And I conducted an analysis of the way non-native users of English for scientific articles convey their claims versus what native speakers do. And you can find some interesting differences. So if you just take the word prove. Now, I don't know if you use the word prove or not, but I did a collection of, I took a sample of 191 articles in the discipline of food science. And I looked for this word as an example of sort of non-hedging, right? Do you think I found any examples of prove in what the Irish or the British, the Americans, the Canadian authors write when they talk about the results? Yeah, you did find prove, but look at the way they use prove. What do you see here? How is the word prove being used? Not really like prove like strong evidence, but rather it's more like shown, like has been shown to be difficult or shown to be beneficial. So you don't find very many examples. You have 71 total examples of 100 out of the 191 articles. Contrast that with the non-native equivalent. So it's the same journal, but in the same volumes. But look at the way prove is used here. Here you see a lot of prove that. So for example, a chi-squared test was applied to prove that these results proved the importance. And the effect of the sound of the way this sounds is to the critical reader is, wait a minute, you haven't proven everything here. It sounds overly confident. And so what does this do? This just raises the suspicion of the naysayer and weakens the effect of what you want to create as the author of the article. So contrast this with the way that the authors of the meat smell article did. They will use words like speculate, could be due to, may expect. What does that mean? They're making a claim, but they do so, they make a claim carefully, but beyond that, they also recognize that they have to go beyond just making the claim, and they go ahead and they add information to justify that claim. So they're careful in the way they present the claim. Here, we propose that it could be due to changes in the amount of aliphatic acids, but then they go on and they say why they think that, not just the what, but the why. And they use hedges to do so. So to finish the session here, can you find a claim here in this? And this is again from that same article of the meat and the smell. Is there a claim that you can find in this text? Yeah, so it's the third one. The first one, they're talking about environmental factors putatively shaping odor signature are numerous. But here, they're just kind of talking about a number of variables that can be considered. But here they're saying, we suggest that the main, number 3, we suggest that the main non-genetic source of auxiliary odor variation is actually due to differences in diet. That's a strong claim. Of course, they only make that after they've discussed, they've presented the whole research. But then they say, our opinion is supported by our study, which showed that, by a study of hand odor twins, and they talk about other studies, and they go on to talk about Wallace, they talk about Pepper. And so they say, that's why we believe not just our study, but other studies support this, that the main difference, not just smoking, not just drugs, not just diseases or infection, but actually the main difference is diet. So they make a claim and then they support it. But they use the word suggest. So there's a limitation to the claim, but still it's supported. All right. Final tips about limitations. Well, first of all, try to remember to consider your limitations from top to bottom. In other words, even in your title, like the one I showed you early on, where there was talk about a multi-country comparison, when in fact you were just talking about Belarus and Russia. Think about what are the limitations of not just your method, but your study as a whole, from the very beginning, the title to the abstract, introduction, and so on. Whenever possible, try to engage critical input before manuscript development and submission. This can be anything from showing your article to someone at the writing center, for example, who looks at it and gives you any kind of input about maybe you should be careful with how you say this or how you say that. But especially if you can, whenever possible, present your research at scientific events, at conferences and seminars and so on before you actually write the manuscript, because those people in the audience, the participants, when you present your research, are kind of like a bunch of naysayers, and they're listening to you present your research, and they're trying to find holes. And sure enough, you're going to find someone who's going to raise their hand and say, what about this? Have you considered that? And maybe you haven't considered that, or even if you have, maybe you thought, oh, if they're asking about this here in this conference, I better make sure I include this in my presentation, in my manuscript. Then finally, the last suggestion I would make is that if you're not already, try to become a reviewer for a journal in your field. Often journals are looking for good reviewers, and so if you offer to become a reviewer, there's a good chance that they'll consider you to be on their board. At the very least, don't just simply refuse invitations to review manuscripts, because it is in this way that you begin to become yourselves the naysayer and learn to think like the naysayer. And if you can think like the naysayer about other people's manuscripts and develop that thinking, it makes it easier for you to think of that person when you write, and write with that audience in mind. All right, so that's it. I thank you for your participation. May your deodorants be pleasant smelling and your meat consumption be minimal.